Hey friends, what's going on? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Kuf Nun Hey, Daf 155 of Masechta Shabbos. Okay, here's the thing about Daf Kuf Nun Hey. I think it's hard. I can't say for sure. Okay, let's go weiter. So, an overview. So we're going to continue on our discussion of Stadin and Tzidate Stadin. Well, I don't think that we got into Tzidate Stadin yesterday, right? I think just Stadin. But now we're going to introduce something called Tzidate Stadin, which, let's just say, like, take Stadin and then, what's it called? When you put that little number to the, like, top right? Exponentially. It's exponentially as fun as Stadin was. So, enjoy that. And then, although it's not that big of a deal. And then we get into like feeding animals pretty much for the rest of the daf. And yeah, whatever, tircha when it comes to feeding animals, stuffing stuff down animals' throaties. And that's what we're talking about. Friends, daf kuf nun daled amud beis, about 6 lines from the bottom, 2, 4, 5 lines from the bottom. Lema ketanoi. Okay. So let us say that, okay, yesterday we had this machlokas between Rabbah and Abaye about can you use the sides of animals, really? But then we tried to bring proofs based on trees, because both when it comes to animals and when it comes to trees, we have the same concern, that if you ride an animal on Shabbos, you might then pull a branch off of a tree to help you navigate the animal. And also, when it comes to climbing a tree and using a tree on Shabbos, we're concerned that you might pull off a branch. So now Abaye found Rabbah, who was playing with his child, and he was sliding the child off the side of the donkey. And Rabbah seemed to have no problem with using the side of an animal. Now Abaye said you can't use the side of an animal. So, and the same would be applied to using this. The same would apply to using the side of a tree. So. So that's machlokas between Abaye and Rabbah about can you use the side of an animal or not. So the Gemara wants to say, well, let's say that this is a machlokas tanoim. Okay, fine. So lema ketanoim. So let's say it's a machlokas tanoim. In Odin la biyamtiv, Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer Mishim Reb Meir Odin la biyamtiv. So we have a brisa in which we say that Mistama we're talking about when you have a sukkah that has 2 proper walls, and the third wall is a tree. So the Tanna Kama says you would not be allowed to go into this sukkah on Yom Tov, even though it's a kosher sukkah, but you wouldn't be able to go into there because we're concerned about using this tree. And Reb Shimon ben Elazar says in the name of Reb Meir that you would be able to go into this sukkah, no problem. My love, and the Gemara wants to say, let's say that the following is the machlokas between the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Reb Meir. The Marsavert Stadin Asurin Umarsavert Mutarin. So let's say that we're talking about Stadin. Let's say that we're talking about where you have 2 proper walls, 2 man-made walls. The third wall of the sukkah is a tree that then you kind of like etched out some part of the tree. You took a board and you stuck the board into the tree, and that's going to be your third wall. And this board would be considered tzidei ilan, the side of a tree. And so let's say that the Tanna Kama, who says that you would not be allowed to go into the sukkah, holds that tzidei ilan is asur, and that would be, and Rabbah would be like that, like the Tanna Kama. And Reb Shimon ben Elazar says in the name of Reb Meir that you're allowed to go into the sukkah. Well, he would say that the Tanna Kama who says that it's asur would be like Abaye, who says that tzidei behema and also tzidei ilan is asur. And Reb Shimon ben Elazar, who says in the name of Reb Meir that you would be allowed to go into this sukkah, he would say that tzidei ilan are mutarin, and Rabbah would hold like this. Would hold like Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Rabbi Meir. Okay? So Abaye, who says that tzidei behema and also tzidei ilan are asur, would hold like the Tanna Kama. And Rabba, who says that tzidei behema and subsequently tzidei ilan is mutter, would hold like Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Rabbi Meir. So now Amar Abaye. So Abaye responds, and of course Abaye, who holds that tzidei behema and tzidei ilan are asur, well, clearly he's going to want to make the claim that everyone agrees like him, that both the Tanakama and Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Reb Meir agree that tzidei ilan are asur. Okay, well then why does Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Reb Meir say that you would be allowed to go into this sukkah on Yom Tov? So Amar Abaye lo duchuli amat stadin asurin. Both the Tanakama and Reb Shimon ben Elazar mishum Reb Meir hold that stadin are asurin. Well then how come you're allowed to go into the sukkah according to Reb Shimon ben Elazar mishum Reb Meir? So v'hacha b'tzidei stadin kamiflagei. No, here this isn't a case of stadin, of the side of a tree. This is tzidei stadin, the side of the tree. And there is where we have a machlokas, that there's a mandam who says tzidei stadin would be mutter. What makes this tzidei stadin? What makes this the side of the side? Well, because in our sukkah over here, you have two proper walls. Now you have this third wall. The third wall is a tree. So the tree, of course, is the tree itself. Now you have this board that we kind of, put into a notch in the tree, and it's sticking out of the tree. So that becomes the tzidei ilan. This board is now the side of the tree. But not only that, you're now taking schach and you're laying it and resting it on this board. And then you're taking a pot and putting it on the schach. So you're basically taking a pot, putting it on schach, and that schach is on top of a board, and that board is connected to a tree. So basically what you're doing is you're resting this pot on sort of something that's twice removed from the tree, because you have the tree, and then you have the board, and then resting on the board is the schach, and on that you're putting your pot. And in that case, you're benefiting not from the tzidei ilan, but from the tzidei stadin of the ilan. Okay? And that is where Reb Shimon ben Elazar says in the name of Reb Meir that it would be mutter, and you can go into that, and that's why you're allowed to go into the sukkah, because we're talking about tzidei stadin. However, says Abaye, if you would ask about just, stadin, just the side of a tree, that would be asur. Everyone would agree that that's asur. And that is Abaye's argument. Okay? So, lo dechuli amat stadin asurin vacha betzidei stadin kamiflei. My sover tzidei stadin asurin. So the Tanakama says tzidei stadin is asur. That's why you're not allowed to go into this sukkah. My sover tzidei stadin mutarin. Whereas Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Reb Meir says that you're allowed to use the tzidei stadin. That's why you're allowed to go into this sukkah. Rava Amar. Rava argues on Abaye. Man de asu b'tzadin, asu nami b'tzidei tzadin. Man de shari b'tzidei tzadin, shari nami b'tzadin. Says Rava, look, he doesn't agree with Abaye. Right? Remember, Abaye says everyone agrees that tzadin are asurin, and there's a machlokas by tzidei tzadin. Rava says, no way, no how. If you hold that tzadin are asurin, well then tzidei tzadin are asurin. If you hold that tzidei tzadin are mutarin, well then tzadin are also mutarin. Okay? Fine. That's Rava's opinion. Now Rav Misharsha asks a kasha to Rava. Remember, Rava says that there's low plug, that we're consistent over here. If you say tzadin are asurin, well then tzidei tzadin are asurin. If you say tzidei tzadin are mutarin, well then tzadin are mutarin. Okay, he says, according to Rava, it's all about consistency. Now, Rav Misharsha asks a kasha on Mr. Consistency. And here's his kasha. Guys ready? I hope you're ready, because it's talking about Eruvin. And I hope you're ready for Eruvin, because we have 3.5 months of it coming up very shortly. No, it's Yosid Ba'ilon. So if you have a tree, and you take a peg, and you stick it into the tree. Okay, so now you have a tree, sticking out of the tree is now a peg. Okay? V'tala ba'kalkala l'mayla me'asar etfachim. Ein eruvo eruv. So, again, so no, it's Yosid Be'ilan V'tala B'kalkala. Okay, so what you did was you have a tree, then you take some kind of a peg, a stake, and you shtup it into the tree. So you have a tree that's standing vertically. Now you have a peg that is horizontally, perpendicularly stuck into the tree. Now, you take a basket and you hang it from this peg that is stuck into the tree. Okay. And now in the basket is your bread that you're using for an Eruv. Because what's an Eruv, of course? An Eruv is basically, you set up some food somewhere, and the food is there when Shabbos starts, and that is where it's considered that is where you are for Shabbos. It's where your meal is, where this food is. Okay? So what you did was, you wanted to set up shop for Shabbos, by this tree. So you have this tree, you took a peg or a stake and you stuck it into the tree. You then hung a basket from this peg, and in the basket is your bread, and that bread is going to be your Eruv. Okay. So the Gemara says, so if you stick this peg into the tree, v'talaba kalkala, and then you hang a basket from the peg. Now, l'mayla me'asar tfachim. So if this basket is above 10 tfachim from the ground, well then ein eruvo eruv, that is not going to be a good eruv. How come? Well, because as I said a minute ago, that if you leave bread somewhere or a meal somewhere and it's there when Shabbos starts, so it's like that is where you're having Shabbos. So now here's the thing. Here's this tree. This tree is in Rishus HaRabim somewhere. Okay? Outside of the city somewhere, in Rishus HaRabim, right? Because wherever you are for Shabbos, you then get 2,000 amos from there to travel. So let's say maybe you made this area, let's say you wanted to travel somewhere, right? Maybe there are two cities that are next to each other, but they're 4,000 amos apart. Now you can only travel 2,000 amos outside of your city. So what you do is you find the tree halfway between these two cities, and you put this bread in a basket and you hang it from the tree, and then it's considered like that's where you are for Shabbos. And now you can walk 2,000 amos in either direction, and you can go to whichever to and from the two cities, right? So now here's what you do. So you want it to be as if you're spending Shabbos under this tree that is in Rishus HaRabim, in between the two cities. But here's the thing. If you have this peg, and the peg is stuck into the tree, and you have a basket hanging from this peg, and it's above 10 tefachim from the ground, well, friends, Rashi points out that the assumption is that the basket is at least 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim. And if it's above 10 tefachim from the ground, it's its own Rishus HaYachid. That's going to be a problem, friends. Because this bread is now in its own Rishus HaYachid. Now, this guy was planning on spending Shabbos, or at least halachically making it as though he was spending Shabbos in Rishus HaRabim under this tree. But his bread is in a Rishus HaYachid in this basket that's 10 tefachim above the ground. And he can't take something from Rishus HaYachid into Rishus HaRabim, i.e., when he's sitting under this tree and he says, you know what, I want to eat my bread that I have in this basket, he can't take it out and eat it. He's in Rishus HaRabim, his bread's in Rishus HaYachid, which means he has no access to this bread on Shabbos. And if you're going to want it to be a good Eruv, you're going to have access to it on Shabbos. And therefore we're saying that if this basket is above 10 tefachim from the ground, well then the bread that is in this basket is not going to be a good Eruv because it's in its own Rishus HaYachid, and he's planning on spending Shabbos in Rishus HaRabim. He can't take out this bread from the basket in order to eat it, and therefore it is not a good Eruv. As they say, it's a fail. A fail, an F-A-I-L. That did not work out. And then, it's not like he has Shabbos there, and he wouldn't be able to walk an additional 2,000 amas. Okay, so now it's Yaseh Ba'ilan. If you go to a tree and you take a peg or a stake and you stick it into the tree, Vitala Bakalkala, and then you hang a basket from this peg. Well, if it's Lamala Me'asara Tfachim, if this basket if it's Lamala Me'asara Tfachim, if it's above 10 Tfachim from the ground, well, Ein Eruvo Eruv. Well, then it is not going to be a good Eruv because it's considered like the bread is in Rishus HaYachid. He's in Rishus HaRabim. He won't be able to take out the bread to eat it. It's not a good Eruv. Lemata miyud tefachim. However, if the basket is hanging within 10 tefachim of the ground, well then, Eruvo Eruv, it is a good Eruv because the basket is considered like it's in Rishus HaRabim, and so is he. So he could take the bread out of the basket and eat it, and it's a good Eruv, and that's where it's considered that he's spending Shabbos. Now, friends, what does this have to do with anything? So the Gemara says, Taima din no'atz yased ba'ilan. If anybody was wondering, how come he is allowed to take out the bread from this basket? The basket is, after all, to a certain degree, connected to this tree. How can he use the tree on Shabbos? So the Gemara wants to argue that Taima denotes Yasid Be'ilan. That's where the stake comes in. That's where the peg comes in. The reason why he's allowed to take the bread out of the basket is because the basket is not hanging directly on the tree. It's hanging on a peg that's in the tree. So therefore, you have the tree, you have the peg, you have the basket, and then you're taking out the bread from that basket. That basket is tzidei tzadin. It's twice removed from the tree. And because it's twice removed from the tree, you're going to be allowed to take the bread out of this basket because it's tzidei tzadin. Right? Let's go weiter for a second. Halo noatz, but if he didn't stick this peg into the tree and he just kind of hung the basket from a branch, well then afilu lamata miyut tefachim ein eruvo eruv. Even if it was within 10 tefachim of the ground, if there was no peg, if there was no stake, he just took a basket and put it directly on a branch of the tree itself, well then he wouldn't be able to take the bread out of that basket even if it's within 10 tefachim of the ground, because the basket is connected to the tree. So the basket would be considered tzidei ilan, or tzadei ilan, and you wouldn't be allowed to take it. You wouldn't be allowed to use the tzadei ilan. So here we see what? That there's a distinction between tzadei ilan and tzidei tzadim. That we're saying that when he has a tree, and he takes a stake, and he sticks the stake into the tree, and then he hangs the basket from that stake, and in the basket is the bread, and it's within 10 tefachim of Rishus Harabim, of the ground, well then, great, he could take, that's where he is for Shabbos, that's his Eruv, he could take the bread out of the basket, and he can eat it on Shabbos, and it's all good, because the basket is, the bread is really twice removed from the tree. You have the tree, you have the peg, hanging from the peg is the basket, in the basket is the bread. He could take the bread out of the basket, no problem. However, the Gemara wants to say that if there was no intermediary peg, if he just took a branch of the tree itself and hung the basket on the branch itself, which means that the basket is only tzadei ilan, and then the bread was in that basket, which means that when he takes the bread from the basket, he'll basically be using the tzadei ilan, and we're saying that it's not allowed. So it's a kasha on Rava, who says that if you say that tzadei ilan is asur, well then tzidei tzadin would also be asur, right? And if you say that tzidei tzadin is mutter, well then tzadin would also be mutter. Yet over here we seem to be making a distinction where the tzadei ilan would be asur, yet the tzidei tzadin is mutter. Wow, this is exciting stuff. So the Gemara is saying, V'ha'hai Tana, here's this Tana, the Ka'asr b'tzadin, who's saying that tzadei ilan is a problem, v'kashari b'tzidei tzadin, and yet he's saying that the tzidei tzadin is permitted. Amar Rav Papa, said Rav Papa, Hacha b'kalkala d'chuka askinan, d'bahade d'shakil le'eruv, kamanid le'ilan, v'kamishamesh be'ilan gufe. Rav Papa says, no, Rav Misharsha, this has nothing to do with tzadin versus tzidei tzadin. This is a different concern. This concern is that you might end up moving the tree, right? Let's read it again. Amar Rav Papa, hacha b'chalkala d'chuka askinan. Here we are talking about a basket that has a very tight opening, which means that in order to stick your hand into this basket to take out the bread, right, you're really going to have to do some work. Right, the bahadid to kashakil le'eruv, that when you stick your hand into the basket to take out the bread, kamanid le'ilan, he's going to move the tree because it's not, it's going to require a bunch of effort. He's going to have to wiggle his hand in there, take the bread. He's going to be moving the basket. It's going to move the tree. Become shamish be'ilan gufe, and he's going to move the tree itself. Meaning that, so the concern here is that because it's a basket that is so difficult to sort of maneuver. So if the basket is on just a branch of the tree, well then when he tries to get out the bread and he's going to be moving around the basket, it's necessarily going to move around the tree, and that's going to be a problem. However, if he takes a peg and he sticks the peg into the tree, and then he has the basket on the tree, on the peg, and then when he takes out the bread from the basket, even though it's difficult, so maybe it'll move around the peg, whatever it is, but the tree won't move, and therefore that's why it's acceptable. But it has nothing to do with tzadei ilan versus tzidei tzadin. It's just purely a practical concern, which is, are you going to end up moving the tree or not? right? And we don't want you to move the tree on Shabbos. However, if it was just a regular old basket where there's no effort and you can just take out the bread without having to move the tree at all, well then you can even use the tzadin. It's not it has nothing to do with tzadin versus tzidei tzadin. It has to do with will you move the tree or not, right? And if the same Tana who says that you have to use a peg would also agree, according to Rav Papa, but if it was just a regular old basket, you wouldn't have to use a peg. You would just be able to take out the bread, and you wouldn't move the tree at all, and that would be fine. So, it's not a kasha on Rava. V'hilchasa, what's the halacha? Stadin asurin, tzidei tzadin mutarin. So the halacha is that stadin are asurin, okay? Tzidei tzadin mutarin. Tzidei tzadin are mutarin. Okay, fine. So I guess tzadin are asurin, like Abaye would say. And when it comes to tzidei tzadin, I guess we would paskin like the opinion of Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Reb Meir, that it's mutter. Okay. Amar Rav Ashi, instead of Rav Ashi, hashta de amar tzadin asurin. Now that you said that tzadin are asurin, so then haydarga dimadla lo linche inish adikla dehavalu tzadin. So let's say you have this ladder, and the ladder is going up to some, lookout thing next to a palm tree. So you would have to take this ladder and lean it against the palm tree. Well, the palm tree itself is going to be the Ilan. The ladder leaning against the palm tree is going to be Tzadei Ilan. So we don't want you to do that because Tzadei Ilan is Asurin, right? So again, Amar Rav Ashi Ashta the Amar Tzadin Asurin. Now that we said that the sides of a tree are Asur, Haydarga, if you have this ladder, Dimadla, to go up to the palm tree, lo linche inish adikla, do not lean it directly on the palm tree, tavalut stadim, because then the ladder would be like the sides of the tree. Ela linche agavaze levar midikla. What you should do is you should make some kind of nail a plank into the palm tree, and then lean the ladder on that. V'chisalik lo lenech kare agavaze el lenech akanin. So what you should do is basically you should take the palm tree and then nail some kind of piece of wood, some kind of plank into the palm tree, and then lean the ladder on that plank, okay? And then basically the ladder will be tzidei tzadin, which is mutter, right? So you have the palm tree is the tree itself, obviously. You have that plank, which is the tzadei ilan. But then you have the ladder, which is leaning against that plank, which makes the ladder tzidei tzadin. And then he says at the end, and when you go up, lo lenach kari agavaze, don't step on that plank, because then you'll be stepping on the tzidei ilim, which is aser. Ela lisnach akanin, make sure that you only step on the rungs of the ladder, because those are the tzidei tzadin, which is mutter. All right. Yeah, I mean, I said that right. That I thought that this page might be hard. It is. Yeah. I mean, or at least if it's not hard, at least you can't really do it too quickly. What can I tell you? New Mishnah, Matirin Pikiye Amir Lifnei Behema. So you are allowed to open up sort of bundles of straw before an animal, and you can scatter them as well. As a kifin, the Gemara is gonna go to town and try to figure out what all these different activities and materials are. But you can open up amir, you can spread out kifin, avalo es azirin, but not zirin. It's gonna be machlokas what these things are. Ein miraskin, lo es ashachas, lo es achruvin. You can't shred fodder or carib lifnei behema in front of an animal. Bein dako, vein gasa, whether it's a small animal, whether it's a big animal, small animals like sheep and goats, and big animals like cows and donkeys. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'achruvin l'daka. Rabbi Yehuda says that a sheep or a goat, you can shred carib for them. Okay, let's try to figure out what's going on in this Mishnah. Or at least try to have machloksin about what's going on in this Mishnah. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Huna, said Rav Huna, Heinen Pkiyin, Heinen Kifin. Okay, so says Rav Huna, right, so what did the Mishnah say? The Mishnah said that, right, Matirin Pkiyei Amir, Lifnei Behema, Umufas Basin Es HaKifin. Right? That you're allowed to, open up, untie these Pkiyin of straw, and you're allowed to spread out the kifin of straw. So it says Rav Huna that pekiyin and kifin are really the same thing. Okay, Rav Huna heinen pekiyin, heinen kifin. that pekiin and kifin are really the same thing, okay? So what's the difference? So pekiin tray, kifin tlasa. The only difference is that kifin is straw, pekiin is straw that is, so you have like these long sort of sheaves of straw, and they're in a bundle, and if the bundle is tied at the head of it and at the foot of it, like at the top and at the bottom, in two places, well, that's what's called pekiin. Kifin tlasa. And what kifin is, it's the same thing as pekiin, just it's got one extra tie. It's got a tie also in the middle. So if it's got a tie at the top, the middle, and the bottom, that would be kifin. If it has a tie only at the top and the bottom, that is pekiin. What's zirin? Te'arze. Zirin is a bundle of cedar that is moist, that can be used for animal food, but is generally not, and they just let it dry out and it becomes firewood. That's what these zirin are. Okay. V'alchi kamar, and this is what the Mishnah is saying according to Rav Huna. Matirin pekiyei amir lifnei behema umifaspesin. So you are allowed to take these bundles of straw that are tied at the top and at the bottom, and you can untie them, and you can even spread them out for the animal. V'hu adin lechifin, and the same holds for kifin. You could take these bundles of straw that are tied in three places and untie them and spread them out for the animals. However, on these bundles of cedar, you cannot do anything with them. You can't untie them, you can't scatter them before the animal, you can't do anything. Even though technically speaking, they are edible as animal food, but generally you would just dry them out and use them for firewood. You are not allowed to untie them or scatter them in front of the animal. Rav Chizda, my time into Rav Huna. Rav Chizda comes and says, what's the reason for Rav Huna? Kasavar lemitrach bu'uchla tarchinan l'shavuye ochla lo mashvinan. That you are allowed to do work when it comes to food, but you can't make it into food. So therefore, when it comes to straw is animal food. So therefore, you're allowed to untie it. You're allowed to even scatter it in front of the animals. Even though they would eat it without even necessarily be scattering, but scattering is just that kind of the cherry on top, right? If you untie it, they can now eat it. Scattering it makes it much more appetizing for them. And according to Rav Huna, that is acceptable. You can do a tircha when it comes to food. However, you can't make something into food on Shabbos. And therefore, these bundles of cedar, well, this cedar was going to be dried out and made into firewood. You can't just decide on Shabbos that you're going to make this, you're going to use this for animal food. And therefore, you would not be allowed to untie them and certainly not to scatter them. That is Rav Huna's opinion, that you're allowed to be toreach for ochlin, but you cannot make something into ochlin on Shabbos. Now, here comes Rav Yehuda's opinion, which is basically the opposite. Rav Yehuda Amar, heinen pekiin, hein zirin. So Rav Yehuda says that pekiin and zirin are the same thing. Okay? Pekiin, trey, zirin, tlasa. That pekiin is when it's tied at the top and the bottom, right? We're talking about straw that's tied at the top and the bottom, and zirin are tied in three places, the top and the middle of the bottom, right? Basically, Rav Yehuda's zirin is Rav Huna's kifin, right? And they're basically switched places. Kifin, the arze, right? And then kifin, according to Rav Yehuda, is the cedar, right? So Rav Huna's zirin are Rav Yehuda's kifin. So basically, fine. So according to Rav Yehuda, pekiin is the straw that's tied in two places, the zirin are the straw that's tied in three places, and kifin are these cedar bundles. V'achi kamar, and this is what the Mishnah says according to Rav Yehuda. Matirin pekiyei amir lifnei behema aval pispusei lo. You would be allowed to take these bundles of straw that are tied in two places, and you can untie them in front of the animal. However, do not scatter them in front of the animal. Now, v'chifin, when it comes to kifin, which he says are the cedar bundles, pispuse nami mifaspesinan. Not only are you allowed to untie the cedar, you're even allowed to scatter it in front of the animals. Avalo azirin lefaspes lahatir. But when it comes to the zirin, which according to Rav Yehuda are the bundles of straw that are tied in three places, you're allowed to untie them, but you're not allowed to scatter them. Now, Amarav, my time with Rav Yehuda, Rava says, what's going on with Rav Yehuda? What's his opinion? Kasavar shavuye ochla mashvinan mitrach ba'ochle lo tarchinan. So Rav Yehuda has the opposite opinion of Rav Huna, which is that you are allowed to make something into food, but you're not allowed to be toreach with food. You're not allowed to burden yourself with food, but something that is not food, you're allowed to make it into food. And therefore, Rav Yehuda's opinion by the cedar is not only are you allowed to untie it, you can even scatter them, because cedar is not generally going to be used for animal food. And therefore, by untying them and scattering them, you're making it into animal food, and that is acceptable, right? But in order to make it into animal food, you have to untie it and also scatter it. And he says that that's permitted. However, when it comes to the straw, so whether it's the straw that's tied in 2 places or 3 places, as long as it's tied up, well, then the animal can't eat it. But once you untie it, the animal can eat it. And therefore, once you've already made it into food, well, then you can't scatter it, because the animal will already eat it when it, as long as it's untied, and therefore you can't go the extra mile to scatter it, because that would be tircha by food, and Rav Yehuda says tircha by food is not allowed, but you would be allowed to make it into food, okay? So Rav Huna's opinion is that you are allowed to do tircha, you're not allowed to make something into food. Rav Yehuda has the opposite opinion, which is that you are allowed to make something into food, but you're not allowed to have tircha when it comes to something that's already food. Okay, so that's a machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. Now the Gemara is going to try to disprove Rav Huna twice. The first time it will fail, the second time it will succeed. The Gemara will then try to disprove Rav Yehuda twice and will fail both times. Okay, so says the Gemara, Tanan, first attempt to disprove Rav Huna. We learn in our Mishnah, in Raskin es hashachas v'esachruven lifnei behema bendaka uvengasa. Our Mishnah says that you're not allowed to shred fodder or caribs in front of an animal, and that's whether it's a behema daka, like a sheep or a goat, or a behema gasa, like a cow. Okay, so my lav charuvin dumi deshachas. So what are these caribs, and what is this fodder? Well, let's say that from the fact that we're listing carib and fodder together, it must be that we're talking about carib that is similar to fodder. Mashachas derkiche, af charuvin derkiche. Just like fodder is soft and edible for animals, well then we must also be talking about carib that is soft. Okay? And what are we saying? And we're saying that you are not allowed to shred it for the animals, meaning it's already edible, it's already soft, and we're saying that you're not allowed to shred it. So we're saying that you're not allowed to do extra tircha when it comes to ochel. We're saying that this carib is soft, it's already ochel, and we're saying, but you can't shred it. You're not allowed to do extra tircha when it comes to ochel. Alma lo tarchinan be'ochla utiyuvte de Rav Huna. So we see that you're not allowed to do extra tircha when it comes to food, and it's a kasha on Rav Huna who says that you are allowed to do extra tircha when it comes to food. Amar lach Rav Huna will respond to you and say, no, friends, it's just the opposite. Lo shachas dumya de charuvin. Lo shachas dumya de charuvin. Rather, it is fodder that is similar to carib. Ma charuvin de akushe av shachas de akushe. Just like carib is hard, well, we're also talking about fodder that is hard. And because it's hard, it's not edible. And if you will be shredding it, then you will be making something that isn't food into food. And Rav Huna says that that is what is not allowed. You're allowed to do tircha for food, but you're not allowed to make something into food. And that is why the Mishnah is saying that you're not allowed to shred fodder and caribs for animals, because it's hard and it's not food, and you'd be making it into food, and that's not allowed. When do you ever have fodder that is too hard for an animal to eat? The answer is be'ile zutre, for young donkeys. That young donkeys, the fodder can be too hard for them. Okay, fine. Very good. Next attempt to disprove Rav Huna. Tashma, come in here. Rabbi Yehuda matir b'charuvin lidaka. So Rabbi Yehuda says that you would be allowed to feed carib to a behema daka, okay? And lidaka in ligasalo, that implies that you'd be allowed to feed charuvin to a behema daka, but not to behema gasa, okay? Now, the assumption at this point, well, throughout the Gemara really, the assumption is that Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanna Kama agree Rabbi Yehuda is really just clarifying the Tanakama and saying, hey, Tanakama, you should nonetheless agree with me that charuvin for behema daka should be allowed. Okay? So, based on that, what does the Gemara say? So, I'amar bishlama Tanakama savar mitrach be'ochla lo tarchinan shavuye mashvinan. So the Gemara says, look, if you understand the Mishnah like Rav Yehuda, which is that you're allowed to make something into food, but you're not allowed to go and do extra tircha for something that's already food, well then I can understand the dialogue between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. Basically, what the Tanakama is saying is that, well, the carib and the fodder are soft, and therefore they're already food. And if you're going to be shredding them, well, you're going to be doing extra tircha for food, and that would not be allowed. To which Rabbi Yehuda is responding and saying, wait, but that's not necessarily always the case. When it comes to carib for a behema daka, even though it's soft, the behema daka still can't eat it, it's too hard. So relative to the behema daka, it's actually not considered food. And therefore, Rabbi Yehuda is saying you should be able to shred carib for a behema daka because that would be making it into food. And that's allowed. You're allowed to make something into food. You're just not allowed to be toreach for food. So, according to the way that Rav Yehuda understands this Mishnah, which is that you're allowed to make something into food. You're not allowed to be toreach for the food. So, for something that's already food. Well, then I understand the dialogue between the Tanakama and Rabbi Yehuda. So let's read in the Mishnah, right? Let's read in the Gemara. So, I understand the way that Rav Yehuda understands the Mishnah, which is Tanakama Savar Mitrach Be'ochla Lo Tarchinan, that the Tanakama says, look, you're not allowed to be toreach for ochel. And this fodder and this carib is already soft, it's already ochel, therefore you can't shred it. Shavuye mashvinan. But nonetheless, you would be allowed to make something that isn't food into food. And Hainu to Ka'am Rabbi Yehuda, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda responds to the Tanakama, Hacharuv in the Daka, Nami Shavuye Ochlahu. That when it comes to soft caribs for a behema daka, well, that's also making something into ochel, because a behema daka will not be able to eat these caribs even if they're soft. Okay, I get it, I understand. However, if you understand the Mishnah according to Rav Huna, that you would be allowed to be toreach for food, for something that is already food, you would not be allowed to make something into food, well then the only way to understand the Tanakama, who says that you would not be allowed to shred carib and fodder for animals, well then the only way to understand that would be to assume that we're talking about fodder and carib that is hard, and therefore it's not food, and shredding it would be making it into food. And that's why you're not allowed to feed it to them. Well then I don't understand the dialogue between Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama. Right? Tanakama savar. If you say that Tanakama holds, shivui ochla lo mashvinan, you're not allowed to make something into food. Mitrach be'ochla mitarchinan, but you would be allowed to be toreach for food. Right, you would be allowed to toreach for something that is already food, but you wouldn't be allowed to make something into food. Well then Rabbi Yehuda, dimatir b'charuvin lidaka, well, if Rabbi Yehuda is saying that when it comes to charuvin to carib, you're allowed to do it for behema daka, well clearly that means that you're not making it into food, because that wouldn't be allowed. It must be that we're talking about toreach for food. It must be talking about that these caribs are already considered food even if they're hard. And it's just an extra tircha. And if it's just an extra tircha for a behema daka, well then certainly it's just going to be an extra tircha for a behema gasa, right? Meaning if we're saying that for this little animal it's already considered food, it's just a matter of doing extra tircha by shredding it up for the animal. Well, if it's food for the little, shredding it up, so that it'll be, just better for the behema daka, well then certainly the behema gasa would be able to handle this carib. Certainly it should be considered already food for the behema gasa, in which case, why would the Tanakama say that you're not allowed to shred up the carib for a behema gasa? Right? Kol shekain legasa. Certainly that if it's already considered food for behema daka, and Rabbi Yehuda is recommending that you should be able to shred it just to make it, a little bit better and more enjoyable for this behema daka, well then certainly it should be allowed for behema gasa, because it's just a tircha after all. So the Gemara says, well, misavar daka mamish. So the Gemara gives a funny answer, which is, wait, well, do you think that when Rabbi Yehuda says daka, it really means a behema daka? My daka gasa. No, really, when Rabbi Yehuda says behema daka, he's not talking about a behema daka, he's talking about a behema gasa. Umay kari le daka, didaika ba'ochla. So why is he calling behema gasa behema daka? Because it chews up its food really well, but it's really talking about a behema daka, or a behema gasa. But one second, the Reisha was talking about, right, the Tanakama was talking about behema daka and behema gasa, which means that they're two different things, not the same thing. So rather kasha. So we say no, it's a kasha on Rav Huna, meaning the kasha stands. Basically, we asked a good question, that according to Rav Huna, who says that you would be allowed to be toreach for ochel. You would not be allowed to make something into ochel. Well then, from the fact that Rabbi Yehuda is saying that you should be allowed to shred up carobs for this behema daka, well clearly we're not making something into ochel. We're just, being toreach for ochel. And if basically this carob is already considered ochel for this behema daka, certainly would already be considered ochel for behema gasa, in which case, why would the Tanakama say that you wouldn't be allowed to shred up this carob for a behema gasa? So, yeah, we don't answer that question, so it's a kasha on Rav Huna. Okay, now after focusing its attention on Rav Huna, the Gemara now shifts its attention to Rav Yehuda. Tashma, come in here, mechatrin es adluin lifnei behema, ves hanevela lifnei kladim. The good part though is that this isn't as complicated. So we have a Mishnah apparently coming up that says that you are allowed to cut up, it's on Kuf Nun Vav Amud Beis, that you are allowed to cut up gourds for an animal, and you're allowed to cut up nevela, a carcass meat for dogs. My love, and mistama diluin dumen dinevela. Mistama were saying that the gourds, we're comparing gourds to this carcass that you're cutting up for the dog. Manevela dirkichaf diluin dirkiche. Just like nevela is soft, meat is soft, well also we're talking about gourds that are soft. And if they're soft, they're already edible. And if they're already edible, well then, why would you be allowed to cut them up? It sounds like we're allowed to do extra tircha when it comes to food, which is a kasha on Rav Yehuda, who says that you're not allowed to be toreach for food. You're only allowed to make something into food. But once it's food, you can't be toreach. So alma tarchinin be'ochla. So we see that you're allowed to be toreach when it comes to food. V'tshuvta de Rav Yehuda. It's a kasha on Rav Yehuda. Amalach Rav Yehuda, lo. Rav Yehuda will say to you, no, that's not what the Mishnah is talking about. Nevela dumididiluin. Rather, it's nevela, it's meat that is similar to gourds. Madluin da ashune, af nevela da ashune. Just like gourds are hard, we're actually talking about meat that is hard. Ve'echi mishkachasla. And how do you find hard meat? What do you think, guys? How do you find hard meat? Obviously, sarpile, elephant meat. Yuck, right? Inami, bigur yasa zutre. Or we're talking about little dogs that even just regular meat is difficult for them. So therefore, Rav Yehuda says that the Mishnah is talking about gourds that are not soft, right? They need to be cut up in order to make them edible. That's why you can cut them up. And if they were soft, then you wouldn't be allowed to be toreach according to Rav Yehuda. So we're talking about gourds that are hard, and therefore we're talking about meat that is hard as well. Tashma, coming here, the Tani Rav Chanan min Arda taught, mefarchin teven v'aspasta u'me'arvin. You can take straw and fodder, and you can break them into pieces and mix them together. So so we see that even though you have fodder and straw, which is already food the way it is, you could be toreach to break it up and mix them together. So we say no. Tevin b'tiv nasaria aspasta be'ile zutre. The straw that we're talking about is straw that's like a shtickle, like rancid, and therefore you can't really eat it exactly the way it is. You have to kind of, break it up a little bit and mix it together with this fodder. And this fodder is also talking about for young donkeys that needed to be broken up as well. And therefore, in its natural state, these things wouldn't be ochel. You have to make them into ochel, and therefore that is why you could be toreach to make them into ochel. Okay, fine, very good. So that was machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda about how to be toreach for animal food. The good part, so the first Amud was really hard, like all that Erev and stuff, and then also this complicated machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. But the rest of the page isn't like really that hard, I think. But let's decide together. Says the Mishnah, Ein ovisin es agamo. So we don't make. Oh gosh, how do I read this Mishnah? Just after I said that, like, this shouldn't be too hard. It really isn't that hard. It just doesn't make sense. Are those two different things? Hard to tell. But anyways, so the Mishnah lists all sorts of things, and the Gemara kind of explains them. So I don't know. Let's just move on. So ein ovsin es agamo. You can't be ovsin es the gamo. We're going to see what that means. V'lo dorsin. You can't be dorsin either. Ava mal'itin, but you can be mal'itin. Ve'ein ma'amirin es agalim. You can't be ma'amirim the agalim. Ava mal'itin and mahalktin the tarnagolim, but you can be mal'itin and mahalktin the tarnagolim. Again, let's read the Gemara and we'll figure out what these things are. It will be clear. Friends, have I ever left you astray? Maybe. But hopefully this won't be one of those times. V'nosnin ma'im lemorsan avalo govlin. Okay, this is kind of clear. You can take water and pour it into bran, just don't mix it together. V'nosnim ma'im lifnei dvorim lifnei yonim shebeshovach. Don't put water in front of bees and in front of doves in the dovecote. Aval nosnim lifnei avazin. But you can put water in front of geese, v'tanagolin, and chickens, lifnei yone hardesios, and in front of the herdosian doves or something. Alright, friends, let's try to figure out what's going on. My in ovsin. Great. When the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to be ovsin es a behema, what is that? So we're talking about feeding animals and different kinds of like manual feeding of animals. So Amar Rav Yehuda in osin la evus besoch me'el. It means that you can't force feed the animal so much that it's like it has a feeding trough inside of its stomach. Meaning before they would go out on a long trip, a long journey, like in the desert or something, so they would load up the camel with lots and lots of food for like 2 or 3 days worth of food. And it wasn't necessarily so pleasant probably if you were the camel, but they would take food and just stuff it, like mamish, stuff it down that camel's throat. So much so that there was like a feeding trough inside of its stomach. And that's what ein obsin means. You don't make like an avus, you don't make a trough in its stomach by filling it up with so much food. Mi'ika kiai gavna, is it really possible to do such a thing, to stuff up a camel to such an extent that it's like there's a feeding trough in its stomach? Yes, it is possible. And it's like Rav Yirmiyah Midifti said, I saw a certain Arab merchant, the achla kura ve'atina kura, that he fed his camel a kor's worth of food and then packed another kor's worth of food on the camel so that he'll be able to feed him more on their way. Now, a kor is a freaking ton of food. It's basically, so I think that the shear that they said was like, so one sa'ah, I think, was 144 eggs worth, and this was 30 sa'ah in one kor. So it's like basically 144 times 30. So it's like a bunch, ki'ilu. Okay. Fine. So ein ma'amirin, okay, we said that you're not allowed to do this ma'amirin thing for a cow. Now, here's the thing, friends. Here's the thing. We talked about camels, we talked about cows, we talked about chickens. It's all the same thing. What you're allowed to do for one, you're allowed to do for the other. What you're not allowed to do for one, you're not allowed to do for the other. Okay? So right now we're talking about ma'amirin, which was in the context of a cow, but the same things that you are or are not allowed to do for a cow, it's the same for a chicken, and it's the same for a camel. Okay? So, ezui hamra'a ve'ezui hal'ata. So what is this hamra'a, which is not allowed, and what is this hal'ata that is allowed? So Amar Rav Yehuda, so Rav Yehuda says, hamra'a l'makom she'enu yichol lahachzir. So hamra'a is that you take food and you shove it down the cow's throat so far down that it won't be able to hock it up anymore. the calf, right, so far down that it won't be able to hawk up the food anymore. Hal'ata l'makom sheyichol lahachzir. But hal'ata, which is allowed, is to place the food, shove it down the cow's throat, but to a place where it could still hawk it up. Great. So that's according to Rav Yehuda. Rav Chizda Amar says, Rav Chizda idi ve'idi l'makom she'eni yichol lahachzir. Rav Chizda says, no, you can shove down that food as far as you want. V'amra bichli hal'ata biyad. So hamra, which is not allowed, is if you do that with a kli. You can't do it with a spoon. Can't do that. But if you do it with your hand, shove it down as far as you want, and push that food as far as you want, even if it's to a point of no return. Okay, so according to Rav Yehuda, you're not allowed to send the food all the way down to where it can't come out anymore. If you send it down to a place where it's still, you can like hawk it up, well then that would be allowed. According to Rav Chizda, he says, no, you could send it down the throat as far as you want, just don't do it with a kli. Masiv Rav Yosef asked the kasha against Rav Yehuda. Now, we have a brisa which says, Mehalkatin l'tarnagolin vein tzarich lomar shemalkitin. So when it comes to a chicken, we're going to have to define what this is, but you are allowed to do mehalkatin, and you're even allowed, and certainly, if you could do mehalkatin, certainly you can do malkitin. Okay? Ve'ein malkitin liyone shovach uliyone aliyah vein tzarich lomar she'ein mehalkatin. Now, when it comes to doves, whether it's doves from a dovecote or doves from some kind of attic, you are not even allowed to do like regular malkitin, and certainly you would not be allowed to do mahalkitin. Okay, friends, what are these things? Well, that's what the Gemara wants to know. My mahalkitin, my malkitin. So what is this mahalkitin and what is this malkitin? Remember, for a bird, you are allowed to do both. For a dove, you are allowed to do neither. So ilema mahalkitin de safela le biyadayim, malkitin de shdi le kamayu. So if you say that mehalkitin is to take some food and stick it down the throat of the chicken, and malkitin is to just take some food and throw it in front of the chicken, okay? And we're saying, so for a chicken, you're allowed to force feed down its throat, and you're also allowed to just put food in front of it. And for a dove, you would be able to do neither. Well, eladiyone shovach v'yone aliyah mishda kamayu nami lo. So that implies that when it comes to these doves, not only are you not allowed to feed it, down its throat, to force feed it down its throat, but you're not even allowed to just throw it in front of the doves. Why not? What's wrong with just throwing food in front of the doves? So ella lab. So rather, what it must be talking about is mehalkitin is lemakom she'eni yichol lahachzir, malkitin is lemakom sheyichol lahachzir. Rather, it means that but what you're allowed to do for the chickens is that not only are you allowed to just force feed the chickens to a place where it could hawk up the food, you can even force feed it so far down its throat that it can no longer hawk it up. Now, when it comes to doves, you can do neither. You can't force feed a dove at all, but you would be allowed to throw some food in front of the dove. Michlal, which seems to be implying, damra bechli, which means that, meaning, we're saying that you would, when it comes to the chicken, and of course, as we said, the same applies to a calf, and the same would apply to a camel, you would be allowed to shove down the food all the way down the chicken's throat until it can no longer hawk it up. So then what's hamra? What is the thing that's not allowed? It must be bikli. That what's not allowed is to do it with a spoon. Like Rav Chizda says. But you would be allowed to shove it down the chicken's throat, or the calf, or the camel, all the way down till it can no longer hawk it up, as long as you do it with your hand. Utiyuvta de Rav Yehuda, and it is a kasha on Rav Yehuda. This brisa is a kasha on Rav Yehuda, who says that you would not be allowed to force down the food to a point of no return, even if it's just with your hand. Because this brisa seems to be saying that you would be. So Amalach Rav Yehuda will respond to you, the olam mahalkatin. Really, when it says mahalkatin, that you're allowed to force feed this chicken, disafile biyadayim, it means that you are shoving food down its throat, but not to a point of no return. Point of no return wouldn't be allowed, right? What we're saying that you're allowed to do for this chicken is just to shove it down its throat to a place where it could still hawk it up. Malkitin, and then what's malkitin? The shadi kamayu, that you just throw a little bit of chicken feed in front of it. And now what you asked, but are you really saying that you wouldn't be allowed to do this for these doves? That for these doves I can't even just take some food and throw it in front of them? Rav Yehuda says, that is absolutely correct. You cannot. Hani mizonosan alecha v'hani ein mizonosan alecha. The chicken is your responsibility to feed. The dove is not your responsibility to feed because it can just go out and find its own food. Therefore, you don't have a responsibility to feed it, and you cannot even throw food in front of the dove. When it comes to the chicken, you could throw food in front of the chicken. You can even force feed it to a place where it could still hock it up, but not past that, according to Rav Yehuda. Kidatana, as we learned in a brisa, nos nemizonos lifnei kelev, ve'nos nemizonos lifnei chazir. You're allowed to put food in front of a dog. You're not allowed to put food in front of a pig. Uma hefresh ben zeh lazeh. What's the nafkamina between a hunt and a pig? Zeh mizonosav alecha, v'zeh ein mizonosav alecha. Well, the hunt, you have a chiyuv to feed, whereas the pig, you don't have a chiyuv to feed. Amar Rav Ashi, said Rav Ashi, masnisa nami deka. You can also imply this from our Mishnah, that you're allowed to feed animals who it's your responsibility to feed them, but not animals who it is not your responsibility to feed them. You're not allowed to put water in front of bees, nor in front of birds that are in the dovecote, the doves in the dovecote. But you are allowed to put water in front of geese, in front of chickens, in front of these doves that you do feed, that are domesticated. My timer, Rav Ashi wants to say, how come you're allowed to put water in front of like the geese and the chickens and not in front of those other doves? Lav mishum, is it not because the hani mizonosan alecha, that it's your responsibility to feed the geese and the chickens and the domesticated doves, v'hani ein mizonosan alecha, whereas the bees and the other doves, it's not your responsibility to feed them, and therefore you don't put the water in front of them? So the Gemara says, one second, there's a hole in that logic, because what the Mishnah is saying is that, when it comes to, let's say, bees and these other doves, you're not allowed to give them water, but the implication might be that you're allowed to give them other food. And ulataymeich, according to Rav Ashi, ma'ir yamaya, what's so special about water? Afilu chite v'sarinami, then you also shouldn't be allowed to give them, wheat and barley and stuff like that. But the Mishnah, strictly speaking, doesn't seem to have an issue with that. So, right, v'sarinami lo ella shiny maya deshchiche ba'agmano. So from our Mishnah itself, we could just argue that water is different because they could find water anyways, and therefore, you're not going to give them these things water, like bees and stuff water, but other food you might be able to give to them. So it's not necessarily a proof from our Mishnah, but we do still have that other brisa which says that that you feed a dog but not a pig. Fine. Darish Rabbi Yonah, so Rabbi Yonah darshaned a pischa de Benesia, by the entrance of the Benesia. Now the art school actually defined Benesia as the exilarch, which is the Reish Galusa. I didn't realize that the Benesia and the Reish Galusa were the same. Interesting. At least according to that view. Maidich said, what does the pasuk say in Mishlei? Yodea tzadik din dalim, that a tzadik, a righteous person, knows the sort of judgment of the destitute. Yodea kadosh baruch hu b'kelev shemzonosav mu'atin, that God recognizes that that a dog doesn't get much food. I assume that it's not talking about a domesticated dog, or maybe it is talking about a domesticated dog. But the point is, whatever it is, nobody was giving the dog too much food. So lefichach, therefore, shoa achilasu b'me'av gimel yamim. Therefore, because God knows that the dog doesn't get to eat too much food, that is why He created the digestive system of a dog, so that food stays in its digestive system for 3 days, so that it can remain full for a longer amount of time. How do we know this? As we learn in the Mishnah, so let's say you have a dog that takes a bite out of a corpse. And now, of course, kazayas basar hames, right? A kazayas from a flesh of a corpse is mitame in a be'ohel. So let's say you have this dog. This dog eats some of this corpse, and then the dog goes inside a house. So that wouldn't be mitame the house, because as long as the dog is alive, the human flesh in its tummy would not be mitame the house. However, what if the dog now drops dead? So now you have a dead dog, and inside the dead dog's tummy is dead human. So the question is, will the dead human inside the dead dog be metame the house? And so we say, well, as long as it hasn't yet been digested, well, yes, then the human flesh is considered intact, and it will be metame ba'ohel. So bikelev gimel yamim me'es le'es. So for a dog that is 3 24-hour periods, over the course of 3 24-hour periods, the human flesh is still considered intact and will be metame the house. Whereas by chickens and by fish, I guess it will digest the human flesh fast enough that, the amount of time that it would take, I guess, to burn the flesh is the amount of time that it would take for it to be considered digested and no longer metame ba'oil. Amar Rav Hamnuna, said Rav Hamnuna, Shma mina orach ara lemishda umtu l'chalba. So says Rav Hamnuna, from the fact that we see that God cares so much to take care of the dogs, right, and He makes sure that it takes 3 days to digest their food so that they could stay full, well then we should also do our part. And orach ar lemishda umtu l'chalba, we should give meat to a dog. V'chama, how much meat should we give to the dog? Amar of Mari, mishach udne v'chutra basre. Says of Mari, just give it enough meat that's like the size of its ear, not too much meat, and then you give it a little hit with a stick, and so that's what you do. Give it a little bit of meat and a hit with a stick. Hanimi libedavra, right? So that it goes away and doesn't come back and won't latch onto you for more and more food. Hanimi libedavra. Now this is like out in the woods. But if it's in the city, then then you don't do that. Also the misjach is just going to follow you around forever, and you don't want that. Amar Papa leis the anya michalba leis the aser michazira. Interesting. Says of Papa, there is nothing that is poorer than a dog and nothing that is wealthier than a pig, because a pig will just eat anything and it's happy with whatever you give it, and apparently people feed pigs a lot. Okay. Tana Kavase Rav Yehuda, there is, after all this, there is a brisa that supports Rav Yehuda, who says that you are not allowed to shove down the food to a point of no return, but you are allowed to shove it down to a place where it could hawk it up. So, Tani Kavasi to Rav Yehuda, Ezu hi hamra, what is this hamra that is not allowed? Ve'ezu hal'ata, what is this hal'ata that is allowed? Hamra marbitza ufokes espia umachila kashin umayim bevas achas. So hamra, which is not allowed, is you basically force the animal to its knees, you then force open its mouth, and you just keep on force feeding it vetch and water, until you can't do that anymore. That sounds gross. Halata ma'achila me'umad, whereas halata is that you feed it while it is standing, umashka me'umad, and it drinks while it's standing, v'nosni kashin b'fnei atzman, umayim b'fnei atzman, and you feed it vetch separately and water separately, i.e. you're not like force feeding it as severely. V'nosna mayim lemursan chulei. So the Mishnah had said that you're allowed to add water to bran, just don't mix it together. Well, it didn't, yeah, exactly. It says just don't mix it together. Says the Gemara, Amar Abaye, says Abaye, Amrisa Kame Demar, I said it in front of Master, Masnisin money. And I said, who is the author of this Mishnah? Now, interestingly, we've seen a few times that when Rav refers to Mar, he's referring to Rabbah. However, the article wanted to say that it's referring to Rav Yosef, which is interesting, although there is something going for that in that this machlokas that we're about to quote came up on Daf Yud Ches, and that was Rav Yosef quoting it over there, so that would make sense, because after all, both Rabbah and Rav Yosef were the teachers of Abai. So Amar Abai, Amisa Kame Demar, I said this mission in front of Master, who will say is Rav Yosef, Masnisa Money, who is the author of this Mishnah, V'amar Li, Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. And he said that the author of this Mishnah, who says that you're allowed to add water to bran as long as you don't mix it together, is Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. The Tanya, as we learn in the Brisa, Echanosin es hakemach ve'echanosin es sochamayim. If Reuven pours some flour into the bowl and Shimon pours the water into the bowl, ha'achron chayev divrei Rabbi Yossi, divrei Rabbi. So Rabbi says that Shimon is going to be chayev for adding water, even though he didn't mix it together. Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda Omer Eino Chayiv Achi Gabel. Whereas Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda says, no, Shimon is not going to be chayiv until they actually mix it together. Only at that point are you going to be chayiv. So we see over here also, the author of the Mishnah who says that you're allowed to add water to the bran, just don't mix it together, is going to be Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. Dilma ad kan lo ka'am Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda hasam ela kemach bar gibelhu. But maybe Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda only says that by flour you would have to mix it together, because flour is something that you mix together. Of a morsin delav bar gibuhu. But what about bran, which is not necessarily something that you mix together? Afilu Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda moda. I'll say that even Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says that simply pouring the water into the bran might be enough to be aser. So lo sagadatich, don't think that the Tanik behedja, because we have a brayso that says explicitly, Einos nemaim the morsin divrei Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda, divrei Rabbi. Okay, so we do not pour water into bran according to Rabbi. Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda Omer nos nemaim the morsin, whereas Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says that you would be allowed to pour water into bran as long as you don't mix it together, and therefore Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda is the author of our Mishnah. Friends, that was Daf Kuf Nun Hey. And Shabbos is not going to let up. 2 daf away from the end of the Masechta, but don't think that you're going to get away with any easy stuff over here. Let's review the tons of stuff and intricate things that we discussed on Daf Kuf Nun Hey. So we started off talking about by talking about Studin and Tzidei Studin. Okay, Rabba's opinion was that Studin are mutter, and then certainly Tzidei Studin are mutter. Rava says that you have to be consistent. If you say that Studin is Aser, well then so is Tzidei Studin. If you say that Tzidei Studin are mutter, well then so are Studin. Whereas Abaye says when it comes to Studin, it's Aser. When it comes to Tzidei Studin, the Ma'is it's a machlokes Tanaim between the Tanakama, who says that Tzidei Studin are Aser, and Reb Shimon ben Elazar in the name of Reb Meir, who says that Tzidei Studin are mutter. The halacha is that Studin are Asurin, Tzidei Studin are mutarin. Fine. Next, we talked about tircha when it comes to preparing food for an animal. So we had there the machlokes between Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. Rav Huna said that you are allowed to do tircha for ochel, but you're not allowed to make something into ochel. Rav Yehuda says that you are allowed to make something to ochel, and you're not allowed to do tircha for something that is already ochel. And then we got just now at the end into the machlokes, into how do you deal with feeding animals on Shabbos. So let's actually just start with regular feeding, because that's more normal. So regular feeding, the answer is if it's your animal, you could feed your animal. But if it's not your animal, then you wouldn't feed it. Such as those doves, which can get their own food, or pigs, you wouldn't feed those animals, at least on Shabbos. And but if it's your animal, so then it's mutter. What about force feeding? So we said, well, if you're going to force feed it enough food that it's like it has a trough in its stomach, well, that's not going to be allowed. Now, what if you force food down the animal's throat to the point of no return? Well, if you do it with a spoon, everyone's going to agree that it's not allowed. If you do it with your hand, well, then Rabbi Yehuda says that it's not allowed, but Rav Chizda says that it would be allowed. If you shove it down the animal's throat to a point where it could still hawk it out, well, then everyone agrees that it will be mutter. Okay, and then at the end we had this machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda about pouring water into bran. Rebbe says it's also, Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda says it's mutter, as long as you don't mix it together. Alright friends, that was the Kuf Nun Hey of Masechta Shabbos. Have a great day. Peace out.